Okay, so you should be able to see the screen.
Yeah.
I think. Okay, good.
Yes.
All right, so this is about critical thinking and how we might be able to apply some different ways of thinking to our software products. So we'll start with, what is critical thinking? Like, have you thought about thinking lately? It's kind of meta, isn't it? A lot of people, and you ask anybody, do you think critically? There's nobody who's going to say like, no, not me. Nope. Like everybody says yes. But then if you go and you prod and you say, well, exactly how do you do this? What do you look for? What are the steps you take? A lot of people can't proceed to articulate what that is. So we're going to dig into a few little steps and some things that you could do to help improve thoughts and cognition, and that should in turn help us build better teams and processes and design better software products. So hopefully. Also will help us protect ourselves from some folks who do know how to apply critical thinking to take advantage and scam people, because this actually happens quite a bit. So we'll start with the definitions. Google, if we go out there and we look, it says it's the objective analysis and evaluation of an issue in order to form a judgment. It's very bland, boring sounding, right? Dictionary says disciplined thinking, which it doesn't really define, except that it's clear. Rational also doesn't define those things. Open-minded, informed by evidence. Okay, well, informed by evidence seems pretty obvious. All these other things like rational and open-minded mean different things to different people. So we can look at these definitions, but are they always helpful? Not necessarily. So we'll look at some more things that we can do. So if we were to think about thinking, we might go and look at these definitions, but we might not actually find any usefulness out of them. But we do need something to put in our textbooks, right? We do need dictionaries. So that's what we get when we look up these definitions. So what it is applied thinking and problem solving, and really an elimination of biases. So this is the why we should critically think. It's also kind of what it is as well, right? We could solve problems with thinking and cognition, and we could build better products. We do so by avoiding things like fallacies, spotting biases, crafting better arguments. Now, an argument will probably come up in debate club, maybe not in a product per se. However, when you have meetings with your colleagues and you have, stakeholder meetings and other type of communication on your team, you will have discussions and arguments about things. And by argument, I don't necessarily mean a fight. I just mean the back and forth of maybe opposing opinions, or sometimes even some agree and some don't. Also honing judgment and improving decision making. That's a big one too. Improving the decision making is really where critical thinking shines, I think. So we can use ways to spot all of these things that pop up and kind of get in the way as blockers of us being able to think a little bit more logically. As programmers, we tend to actually think of everything as just a programming challenge or an algorithm. Well, I have to do this, therefore I will find an algorithm that I like and apply that. And then a lot of developers even abstract that away to just, I'll go to Stack Overflow, copy and paste the code without even thinking or anything. All they do is just Google, which is actually prone to lots of biases and not getting correct code, as many of us can attest. So this is kind of why and what it is. So it's about being able to build better products by being able to cut out some of the common things that happen in product design, team flow, team workflows, processes, and whatnot. and out comes a better product. Okay. So a few steps. The first, probably the most important thing, is applying empathy. If you can't apply empathy, it's because you can't actually see or know much about who you're designing the product for. So empathy is probably actually one of the most important critical thinking steps. And usually nobody even uses that word. If you were to ask, like, try to explain how you might think critically. But again, if you're building a product for people, if you're building a car, you need to be able to think about how people are going to drive it and who the user is. And if you can't get into their mindset, product is just not going to be as good as it could be. Yeah, sure, you might get a car. But if anybody watches The Simpsons, you may have remembered an episode where they allowed Homer to design a car. It was a disaster, a hilarious disaster. And this I see happening in software all of the time. So empathy. You need to also be skeptical, but not so skeptical you just say no to everything, you hate everything. That's just being a cynic. So with being a skeptic, we need to question everything, including ourselves, and most importantly, ourselves and our team and the things we hold dear. We do need reliable sources and facts. This apparently seems to be a problem in modern times, right? Finding reliable sources and facts. But we do need to do that. If we don't have correct data, it's, again, hard to be able to design products. Now, I work for JetBrains, and we make products for other developers. And it's almost harder to make products for other developers than it is users, even if you're a developer and you know this. Because when developers come back and we think we know what other developers are doing, it's often not the case, which is kind of weird because we are developers too. Again, very meta. But the same thing, like, kind of need to be able to get those facts and the data about your user. You need to be able to listen, right? But you can't really have empathy without listening to your users, right? So empathy, and skepticism, right? And just kind of balancing these things. This ties into problem solving, right? So problem solving steps are generally given if you take, a class in university or whatever, and they tell you things like identify the issue, analyze the arguments. They give you this nice little checklist. We're going to work in the part where you analyze arguments and what's happening, discovering facts, and challenging the biases. Sure, you have to do the other things too, but this is where we're just going to kind of focus in for this talk to help do a little bit more of the critical thinking part of problem solving. So the importance of it, again, so there are things called dark patterns. If you haven't heard of dark patterns, actually I have a whole talk on specifically just these patterns. These scam people out of all sorts of money. It's taken people's life savings. Some of them are just a little, douchey, and others are just downright like illegal. But here we are, right? It's modern times and people implement these things. Sometimes, though, and very often, developers implement these not realizing that it's a dark pattern. So it's this kind of pattern that makes the user make a choice that they wouldn't make, or sometimes makes it more difficult for them on purpose to get something done. You ever try to cancel a subscription and you go to the website and you look around, you can't find it, and then finally you do find this link that takes you to a page that says, oh, you have to call, right? That's a dark pattern whenever you see that, right? They're doing that on purpose to wear you down. Look, if you already have children, you're already worn down, because children do this and they don't even realize it, right? They just keep nagging and nagging, right? It's the digital equivalent of that, but for a nefarious purpose. Kids usually just want a piece of candy or something like that, right? If they're small. But, in software, we can actually be taking people's money from them. Elections, right? I don't even need to say anything more about that, right? It's just That's the importance of critical thinking. Think about the past few years. Airplane crashes, right? There have been airplane crashes that are traced back to people, like pilot error, where there's a bias or critical thinking error. And then there's other ones where, of course, airplanes have just been designed not well or not tested enough, or, corners cut, things like that. Social programs, right? Do you want to have good, healthy social programs? I mean, honestly, just look at the US. I think this is mostly a European audience. I'm from the US, and the healthcare system there is a mess. I live in Germany now, so I get good healthcare now. But it's a mess. And a lot of it is that people just can't think critically about social programs. In the US, it's like a thing that we do. We just can't. There's other ones too. Seatbelts. Didn't even consider that children might actually be riding in cars. No empathy for children whatsoever. And then guess what? Kids started dying, and people said, oh crap, that's a problem. And then so what they did was, instead of actually fixing the problem, politicians went and made legislature that said, no, kids got to sit in the back seat. That's not the solution necessarily. It is actually safer for kids, but there's some other things they could probably have done. So scams, there could be all kind of issues, right? Medications, medical treatments are riddled with bias. If you look at Amazon's a good one for this. Microsoft had an AI that went like totally berserk also. If you look at the most recent one, is Amazon scrapped a sexist AI tool because it just threw out all the women's resumes, didn't even look at them. Amazon Go, people actually like it, people of color, because they're, at least in the US, not walked around and followed because of their race, which is a common occurrence of bias and prejudice in the US. So same thing with AI. AI is just terrible. It's terrible for having tons and tons of bias. So if you are biased and you create an algorithm, that's going to be exposed in that algorithm. So yes, math and algorithms themselves aren't biased, but when you create something, that comes out in the algorithm. So these are things we want to prevent, especially when you have things like, jobs at stake here, AI systems, people possibly being arrested, right? Facial analysis and things like that. People can't fly because of that. Or something that's been happening a lot is some of the US's transportation authority lists of people who have similar names to terrorists, and then they end up having to jump through hoops just to fly, but they're just a normal person. They didn't do anything wrong. So you have a lot of this. And a lot of it comes down to not critically thinking. So why we do this and why these things happen, it's about heuristics. So the thing about bias is that it's not bad. People hear this word and they go, oh, that's bad. I don't have it. Except you do. Everyone does. If you're human, you do. Actually, if you're an animal, you do. All animals have bias as well. A lot of people think that bias is simply politically left and right, and that is not what bias is. That's a such an oversimplification that it does not give us any information. But what biases are in humans, and how humans use software, and how humans build software, as well as products in like the tangible physical world, like a mouse or a car or something else. It's all based on these heuristics. And heuristics are basically autopilots, right? What happens with humans is that every single day you have to make decisions all day long, every minute of every day. And you literally cannot think about all of the decisions you're making, because you make about, I think it was something like 95 million decisions every day. Most of them, almost all of them, are subconscious. And that's where the bias is, right? So just the fact that you have a brainstem that controls automatic responses like breathing and heart rate, stuff like that, those kind of things happen automatically. there's a slightly higher level of automatic responses and automatic heuristics that happen. So these are shortcuts that actually facilitate problem solving, but because they're generalizations, they reduce cognitive load. They're really good for immediate judgments, like should I grab this glass of water or not? But when we have to apply them to things like product design or things that are more complex, then they go from being like this nice little shortcut or a pattern or an autopilot thing to an anti-pattern. And that's when biases come out, is when we aren't stopping to slow down and think about it. Now, again, most of the things that we go about our day, we don't actually need to, right? When we need to use the restroom or do, just trivial tasks every day. We don't, it's not consequential, and we don't need to think about it, and we don't. But when it comes to things like software, we do. We need to stop and slow down and take a look at the heuristic load and what's happening there and how we can work in that context to make things a little bit better. So there's some nice links throughout this talk about where you can get more information on this. So without heuristics, we would not have survived as a species. Heuristics mean that if you're out in the jungle and you hear a growl, like run, or maybe don't run. If it's a lion, it'll chase you, but hide or do something because predator's coming, right? So we evolved in this context of heuristics actually made it so we could be here today as actual humans and a species. But sometimes these things, now that we have modern society, it doesn't always fit in well, right? Because it fit in great when we had to survive that way, but we don't anymore. So that's what heuristics, and that's where all this bias just kind of pops up. So we have to design for your customers' heuristics and how they might autopilot and work with software, but we have to balance our own, because we're designing and we're going to present our own biases in there, and we have to deal with theirs. So we have to look at both sides of this equation. There are a lot of studies on heuristics. There's the millions and millions of days of decisions daily, actually possibly billions. It's really hard to calculate because every second, even the fact that you're not doing something is a decision, right? Almost all of them are subconscious. So that's the thing. Bias is subconscious, and people think, oh, it's bad. It's not. It's literally because you evolved as a living being. It's the same things that a cute little lemur does to get away from, some badger or something that's going to eat it. It's the same thing, right? Those heuristics are a little slimmed down for living in the wild. We're applying them to much more complex things, but it's very much a spectrum of survival and nature. But we go on autopilot all day, right? It would just simply be impossible to function if you didn't have these biases to just let you go and just go about your day, doing your regular, harmless daily activities. You can easily be coerced or hijacked, right, with this. There's a couple of really interesting experiments that we'll talk about in this talk that shows how your heuristics get hijacked. And if anybody's read books like Freakonomics, they've showed many of these things. If you've read Malcolm Gladwell's work, he also talks a lot about these. I don't think he necessarily uses the term heuristics, but a lot of science like that shows up in his books as well. So these are very common things. So again, if we think about thinking, right? When's the last time you thought critically about something? Can you sit and say, what steps did you take to solve that last problem? Well, people might say, oh, look, I had to save a file. So I applied this algorithm that would actually take, everything that's in an editor and, build a tree, write it out to disk. But that's not critically thinking. That's just thinking about programming. What we need to think is, what bias is in there? What automatic things might we be doing to write the software? And on the other side, if somebody's going to save a file, what kind of biases do they have when they're saving a file, right? So these kind of things are what we want to think about. Now, in general, we're going to apply this to a little bit, not so much file save, but a little bit bigger concepts. But I'm just using that to show that it's not necessarily about lines of code here. It's about design and teamwork and just building an overall better product. Right? And then once again, just to hammer this home, you are biased. I am biased. We are all. Because if you're alive, your actual experience of being alive means that you're making these unconscious decisions all day. So it's not bad and we have to get over it. But when most people have what's called a biased blind spot, and they go, okay, I hear what you're saying, but everyone else is really biased. It's not me. We are. You may have to tell yourself this every day until it sinks in, but you are, and it's okay. A lot of people get very angry, and I'll give a talk and they'll come up to me and they'll be like, I am not biased, right? But it's actually the blind spot bias talking when they say that, because literally being alive means that you are, because the decision to even come up and say such a thing means, well, you're having a bias right there. And that's fine. It's just that some folks had turned these into bad words politically, right? But it's not. It just means this automatic heuristic. That's what we're really talking about when we talk about a bias. If you oversimplify it into something like, two sides of something, then it's not really a bias, it's a prejudice. And that's very much different. That's like a bias, like super steroids. So how can we spot it in ourselves? How can we spot it in our users to help them be able to work better with software or provide better software for them? So again, a bias is our tendency or inclination to something that's perceived unreasonable. It's just that heuristic. Also, another concept that we're not really going to talk about a lot here is a fallacy, but when you do actually have meetings, you might consider digging up and reading up about fallacies. So when you have interactions with your teammates about how to build products, that you're not making errors in thinking, because that's all that a fallacy is. It's just you made an error in your thinking, and there's common errors, and these errors in thinking are actually patterns. And if there's one thing programmers like, it's patterns, right? So you can learn about these patterns and make sure that you're applying the correct pattern when you're sitting there trying to design software in a meeting. So let's start with the first one here. This one is a really big one. It's called the framing effect. Probably the most notable one is the glass half full or half empty. I rather like this little cartoon with half full, half empty, and no, I think this is piss. So your decisions are influenced by the way information is presented. Right? For a long time, people would just say, half full or half empty, until a little cartoon like this came along, and then people laugh and say this one is quite humorous. So depending on how information is presented, and this is what we do in a digital world, all we're doing is presenting information to users. You may not be a UX person or a UI person. I'm really not too great at that. But you're still writing backend code that connects to it, maybe a REST API, a cloud service, or something that does have to fit in and does have to store that information. And so that it does fit in there. And you also have to work with the greater team, somebody who might be doing parts of the UI. So your information looks more or less attractive depending on how it's presented, right? So if we ask, which do you prefer? If you go to the store, we know from experience and trials over decades, people like 85% lean beef. But if beef is labeled as 15% fatty, it's the same thing. People will not pick up that package. They go after the lean beef. Right? How about this one? Which would you rather hear? That you have a 10%, if you frame it in the positive way, right? 90% chance of surviving versus 10% chance of dying. Like, nobody wants to actually hear the word dying when you're talking about an operation. Literally, the doctor doesn't even want to use this word, right? Well, you have a 10% chance of dying. Like, it sounds awful, right? So but it's the same. It's the same thing as a 90% chance of surviving an operation. But how it's presented is a frame, right? So now, if a surgeon said you have cancer, and we'll do this operation, but you have a 10% chance of dying. When they do present it that way, or every once in a while, this does happen throughout time, people are apt to not go do that. And then they're going to die from cancer when in fact they had a really good chance if they actually took the operation. So this is important. Framing is very important. How about other stuff, right? 20% off versus $120 off. It's the same, right? But depending on how it's positioned, depends on what people go for. Also things like, can I help you? Somebody could say, no, just go away. Or my favorite, when you have those little buskers and they say, can I ask you a question? You just did. Bye. Right? But instead, I'd like to ask you a question. Or in this one, how can I help you? Right? So it's assumed you're going to help. How? Right? As opposed to just, can I? Or here's a good one for school kids. Apparently, we're the 5th best team. Of course, it's only 5 teams. Instead of saying we're the worst team, like no coach would ever want to say to kids, we're the worst team. Now we're the 5th best is a much better way to put that. But as you see, it's the framing. And, these are some fun little, except for the operation, these are not terribly bad examples where you're going to have horrible outcomes, except for maybe some very sad children and the operation. But if you look at things like politics, these things sway elections, but you can also sway your users and how much, if you do the pricing, how much they're going to purchase or what they're going to purchase. And companies like Amazon take full advantage of this. And in many cases, you should, right? You want to sell your service or product and they want that, and it's a win-win. But other times, I'm not saying Amazon are like, tagging anybody or calling out anybody, but just saying there are a lot of places that apply these as dark patterns because they want to take advantage of you, right? So they might frame things in such a way that makes it so that the users are more susceptible to scams. Same thing with like saving lives. There was a whole experiment about this. Like if it's kind of appropriate now with COVID, right? If you're preparing for some disease expected to kill X amount of people, right? How do you frame this, right? Saving 200 lives or 400 people will die. Nobody wants to hear that die word, right? We want to hear it's saving 200 lives. And here again, if you take a look at program A and B, right? 200 lives, 33% chance, 400 people will die, 33% chance. Like if you just take a look at this chart, you can see the framing. Depending on how you look at it, you're going to have that clear preference, right, for positive framing, right? And most people, right, 72% go with program A instead of B, right? So framing is something that we do need to do. So not just when we present options in software, but when you're actually presenting options to your boss, right? Say you want to convince them of something or convince the team like, hey, I think this is going to work for our product. You need to frame it the right way, right? Or, people might not be apt to go for it. So things like when you present to stakeholders, it's also another way to be able to correctly use framing. So framing can it's a very dangerous bias that could be used very nefariously with a lot of people. So do watch out for this. Anytime you see a percent or a number, think about the opposite, right? So if you see something like 33% chance of saving people, flip that over and go with 66%. Another framing is, you see this all the time, the 99-cent thing. Oh, this is $1.99. This is $10.99. It makes it just seem to people from a frame. There's also an anchoring effect there as well. A couple other, sometimes these biases overlap, but stores do this for a reason because it actually sounds lower. $1.99 or €1.99 sounds less than 2. So whenever I see a price with 99, I round it up just all the time in my mind. I'll say that's €2, that's $10, that's 15 yen, whatever it is. And then it just helps keep that a little bit more even keel for yourself. Another effect that we have is the anchor effect. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they've all found this effect. Very common thing. The first piece of information you get, that's the one you want. If you go buy a car, they will use this. And if there's one thing that I hate in life, it is having to buy. Well, actually, I've never bought a car in Europe, so I don't know. Even though I live here in Germany, public transportation is great here. But in the US, buy cars. And I would hate having to go to the car sales lot and deal with the salesperson. You know, sometimes they just seem like the most horrible people. They just wear you down and try to get all your money. I'm sure they're nice to their families and stuff, but I really hate dealing with them. It's so draining. It's awful. I hate it. So the experience, I just don't like it. But this is what they do, right? They will hit you with an anchor number. That list price, that retail price on the car is an anchor number, and it's that price that's in the window. And then they go, that's just the retail price. We could give it to you for X amount of dollars. And then if you trade it in, your older car, they will take a look at what it should be valued at, and then they'll come under and anchor it again. So they anchor the price they want you to pay higher, and the price for your trade-in lower, so that it works to their advantage, because then you have anchored that number in your mind. Also, jobs do this, like companies, big companies, HR does this all the time. And we all hopefully know that HR works for the company, not for the people. So what they're there to do is to anchor you with a certain number. And then you come back and you say, well, I want more. And then you negotiate down into the middle, that classic negotiation strategy. Well, next time they anchor something, say $100,000, then you hit them with a much higher number. You re-anchor it. Right. So that's the thing with anchoring, pricing, salaries, all of that. Search results, Google, nobody goes to page 2, right? They don't, because usually the first link is the most important. Same thing for Amazon listing, right? And you'll notice if you go look for, say, a television on Amazon, Amazon TV will show up, right? So if Amazon has a product, their products will show up first. That's what I would do if I were selling the products and if I were Amazon. And I don't think that's a dark pattern. They just want to sell their stuff. That's perfectly, I think, legit. But Amazon also found out with reviews, they were at one point putting the most recent review as the first one in the list. And they found out that people were relying on it too heavily, even if that review is a completely terrible and crappy review. Not necessarily a bad review of the product, but not helpful at all. So then they ended up trying to played around for a few years with this and put them side by side with a positive and negative review. And then they changed it for the helpful, which is actually kind of helpful. Right, so people can vote and say if it was helpful. And then they put the most helpful ones up there, which is a little bit of a crowdsourced way of doing it. This also ties into what's called a primacy effect that we'll talk about later. But anchoring, it's that first piece of info. So as you know, both ways this is going to work. What are you presenting to the user first, right? And then also in your meetings, right? What's being anchored there, right? So that first piece of information, write it down, and then write down anchor so that you remember that this number is there as that anchor. And then maybe you could remind yourself of the anchoring effect and work around or against that, right? So that's something that you can see every day. Another thing is called choice architecture. Also, this can go into dark patterns. This you see in the physical world every day, as well as online. The grocery store is the pinnacle of choice architecture. Things like stuff that you see all the time. You ever wonder why grocery stores do the things they do? I don't know if it's the benefit or the opposite. Early in my career, I actually worked for Borden Foods and Wise potato chips. And they actually make some of the products on here. And they made a lot of snack foods and things. And we had to write the systems that actually they pay for shelf space in the grocery stores, not just snacks, but other products as well. And what they want is eye level stuff for adults. So they take average heights of adults, and eye level items for adults cost more. And they put stuff for little kids, especially the sugary cereals, like down at the kids' eye level. And it's on purpose. They pay for those prime spots, and then the spots at the end of the aisles and at the cashier, because you get the impulse items. Now, in some states in the US, like, you don't get those cool little bottles of liquor at the cashier, but I love them over here in Europe where you're allowed to have them. It's so awesome. But anyway, it keeps me from buying snacks, but then I buy a little more alcohol. And I know it's an impulse and I don't care, right? Sometimes, there's a bias and you just don't care. It's an impulse, but I don't like it. Anyway, other things like toilet paper and things that you have to buy, right? Maybe it's not the funnest thing to buy, but you have to walk through all of the stuff that you don't need, like the candy and the other things, to get to the essentials. Also, sensory plays. You might smell things or the music or whatever. Flowers in the front, baked goods, and fresh vegetables in the front, right? So that you're overloaded with, yummy food, and you just want to kind of eat it all, right? And they do everything they possibly can to make you hungry. It is a grocery store. And if you just start Googling around and look for like grocery store choice architecture, there is so much cool stuff you could find on what they do in this realm. But the same thing here, if you have an online store or any kind of software, right? You can get people to do impulse clicks, right? Look at clickbait. That's the items near the cashier, right? That's clickbait. Another thing they do, the misleading and confusing labels. This is a dark pattern, I would say, and this is so annoying. Like, you go in and you compare two products, and there'll be two different sizes, and one will say have a price, and the other has a different price. But what you have to do is read that fine print of like the price per gram or the price per kilo, or like the actual unit price, because the price that you pay doesn't really matter as much as, if you're actually going for savings, is that price per the unit, right? And that's in the tiny print and a little bit, pushed down at the bottom of those stickers and a little harder to find. And the same thing in software, right? You'll see prices, even this is presented like the grocery store, right? In Amazon Fresh and some of the other shopping carts online. Same thing with upsells, right? This is like, oh yeah, I need that protection for, almost as much as I paid for the TV. I did not buy this TV, but just to go in and get an example, you get this like little, add to basket. And you notice how they highlight the add to basket in yellow as opposed to the no thanks, which is just bland and quiet, right? But the add to basket is very clear. So there's some things with choice architecture, and I would highly suggest like just going around and looking at dark patterns. Start Googling dark patterns and see all of the shady things that they do. Like one of them again being, and Amazon does pull this one, try to cancel Prime, right? You're digging around in there for at least an hour. People give up. They do. They just, I'm done. We're out of here. Like, screw it. I'll just pay the money, right? That is what a lot of people do. Another type of a bias is cognitive fluency, right? And basically it comes down to, is this easy? All right, we're good. And this works both ways again. Mostly we want to make fluency as fluent for the customer as possible, but then also we tend to like it too, but then we can't have it as a developer. It's going to be a little bit harder for us to make it easier for the other person, but that's how we have to roll. We want good products. So for example, recipes. If anyone here likes cooking and chefing and all of the culinary things, if you go online, you'll notice at one point in time, there were just text recipes, and these are boring, and it's just a lot of verbiage, boring. And you have to read through it like you're reading a science paper, like, oh, mix this, do that, next step, oh, don't forget these ingredients, right? But then now with audio and video, you get like, say, a 2-minute 35-second video here for pancakes. Like, I would much rather, most people would, get to see how somebody's doing something, especially something that is physical, like cooking, and see it and watch it with instructions. But also, you may have noticed that recipes now, they have like the life story of the person who made the recipe, and they'll be like, my grandmother taught me this when I was 10, and we had this great time in the kitchen, and like a whole bunch of stuff. And usually a little link just to jump to the actual recipe after a small novel. Turns out, though, people love stories, right? It's one of our heuristics. We love stories. This is how we have socialized as a species. So with that, if we can make things, clear and easy to read, video stuff that is, easily consumed. There was a recent Twitter conversation with folks who create content, and they said, geez, I make all this in detailed content, and I put out like a 2-hour video on how to program in React, and people only like my 10-minute one. Well, because it's small consumable bits that are easy, and things that are easy actually feel truer, right? Clear and easy to read information makes statements feel truer. So a pancake video as opposed to a lengthy document on every little step to make a pancake. But one with a story, that's an easy to read story about making pancakes with grandma in the kitchen, and then some easy steps, also feels very true. Even if those recipes aren't the best, right? And I actually did get to take some formal culinary education. I can tell you some of those recipes are pure crap, but the stories are exquisite. Much better than the pancakes. So anyway, make things clear and easy to read. Some of you may have noticed also, again, just recently with, politics. The politicians who speak at a 3rd to 5th grade level, they tend to actually get more votes because they don't sound like, pompous people. They don't sound like super elite. They sound like an average person. And also you can understand what the hell they're saying, right? So that's kind of important. The same thing with easiness and rhyming. It makes things feel more true, and bonus, it's easy to remember, right? Rhymes are sublime, right? Click it or ticket. This rhyme was a public service announcement in the US way back when they mandated seatbelts as a thing. This actually had converted into numbers of lives saved because people were so able to remember the click it or ticket campaign. Many people know the apple a day keeps the doctor away. Not actually true. I mean, you have to do a lot more than that, right, for a healthy life. But that is a fun saying. And then fake it until you make it, right? That's another one that's just a fun thing that people say. But if it's easy to remember when it rhymes, and that is why we have nursery rhymes and mnemonics and other things to help with memory. So make it clear. Make it simple. A couple of famous authors that were out there, like Hemingway. Another author said, well, Hemingway as an author, I'll tell you, he never has anybody running to the dictionary to look up a word, ha ha ha, and they were like mocking him, except turns out Hemingway had it, because that is what made people want to read his books. The fact that he kept it simple, right? The KISS principle, but for content, right? And almost all software has some sort of content about it, right? You have to give people instructions and, buttons, UI elements, other things, whatnot, even documentation. And then again, also in meetings, right? So both the building of the software and inside where the customer, right? So rhyming is better. So be plain language. Here's another couple of examples of science behind it, including pregnant smokers, when they got clear language, 3rd grade level material about like why it's bad to, like, basically don't smoke when you're pregnant. That's bad. Then they're like, hey, maybe I'll not do that. As opposed to the ones who got the science-y elite sounding material, right? So we have that.
Yeah,
easy to pronounce also. Campaigns, names, and stocks, right? The higher up the ladder, like CEO, CFO, the easier the names are to pronounce. Not every single time, but very, very often. And there's a few pieces of science that show like, hey, you know what? We took a look at this and turns out this is the thing that happens, right? So it's easier to pronounce. Not saying you should change names, but if you do have stories, maybe make names easy to pronounce within the cultures that they're presented. Right? So if you do any kind of storytelling in software, or if you do storyboards or whatever. Here's another thing. So this is part of cognitive fluency. So people were shown this ad. It was similar to this. It was just a blank ad, so furnish your home in style, something like that. And I showed a lamp on the left. And this would be for English speaking and a lot of Western cultures that read from left to right. And they said, here's another one. And they weren't shown at the same time like I'm showing you, but they said, look, we need to have people find what looks like a antique or a more classic looking lamp. When they went through result after result, people picked the one on the left for the classic or antique looking lamp. When they're asked to look for a modern looking lamp, they pick the one on the right. They're the same lamp, right? So another piece of cognitive fluency is that time is conflated with space and distance, right? Which is something to consider with your sprints and product planning, but also, again, how you present things, depending on it, especially with localization, left to right or right to left, right? Depending on which type of culture you're in, right? If you are in a left to right, stuff on the left seems to be older, antique-y, right? Things on the right seems to be more future, more forward-looking, so more modern. So if you want to present something in a modern way, maybe start putting it over toward the left, right? Do your A/B testing here. This shows up very well in A/B testing. But here they just did it with a blank space and a picture, just to see how this would work. And here we go, right? So people conflate time, space, and distance very often, and we could present that to our users to get them to work with the software the way we need to. Similarly, and this is kind of like anchoring, kind of ties in, but there's this primacy effect, right? Again, stuff that shows up first is the stuff people remember. People don't go to page 2 of Google. So consider carefully when you need to present what goes first. What is, if you're selling stuff, obviously the stuff you want to move is the stuff that needs to go first, right? But sometimes, we have ads, right? So ads, people pay, to be in the search engine optimization and in the results. So that happens on Google and Bing and the other search engines. But that is part of the primacy effect. And that is why SEO is its own industry in our industry because of this. But the same thing for places like Amazon or Shopify or other types of software as well. Here's a good one, and we will have a laugh at the Americans here, right? My people. So we all know McDonald's, right? For better or worse, mostly worse. And McDonald's, it's a US company, and folks in the US will measure with anything but the metric system. So of course we have the quarter pounder, right? And that's, about 113 grams, right? And it's this little burger. And that's been out for the longest time. And then A&W, which is a much smaller fast food chain in the US, actually tasty food with them. And it's a root beer. And then they made these little fast food chains. And they thought, you know what, we will compete with McDonald's. We're going to totally take them. We're going to come out with a third pounder and sell that for the same price. Take that, McDonald's, right? Except this was a flop, a giant, giant, giant flop. And usually this meme goes around the internet and people are like, Americans can't do math, but really it's kind of an anchoring or a primacy effect. people see 1/3 and 1/4, and the number 4 is bigger. And then they said, why would I pay the same for that 1/3 pounder? I could get more with the 1/4 pounder. And it wasn't even about math, it was about a bias, right? Because they just were taking shortcuts and not actually doing the math. So if you're not doing the math, it can't be bad math, right? Because you're literally not doing the math. If they actually sat down and did the math, then they would say, oh, hey, the other burger is more burger for the same amount of money. But yes, this actually happened. And then they turned around and had to do this, what you see on the screen here. They actually had to say it's bigger, genius, right? And actually point out to people that 1/3 is actually bigger than 1/4. I think 1/3 is 130 some grams as opposed to 113. So that happened. Stories are also a heuristic people rely on. Now they have to be fun stories. If it's like a terrible, sad, and story where the puppy dies at the end, like nobody likes that. No, then nobody does. But if you go to this is so fun. Go to the SignificantObjects.com and launchy browser. Here we go. So this was a little project in which the people who were doing the project actually found just random little trinkets that are not valuable whatsoever. Here, little figurines, a plate, a little, I don't even know what that is, a mermaid figurine, like weird, a duck. There was a mallet, a rubber mallet in here somewhere. And they bought these on average for $1.25. They bought 100 of these for a total of $125. And then they ended up selling them for about $8,000. And why? Because what they did was they made up a really fun story about these products. So instead of just saying, this is an odd little mermaid figurine, they actually went and said, this is a mermaid from the beaches of somewhere, or here we go, pollution. And here I am, beach zone, like all this fun stuff, right? So they're making up stories. These stories aren't even have to be true necessarily. But because of these stories, people ended up just buying these like crazy. It was a very fun thing. And because people had not just an object, but a story and a legacy attached to it. So if you get to do any kind of storytelling in your software, right, which often comes in the form of a wizard, you take people step by step through a piece of software. If you have a complex operation, make a story from it and make it as fun as possible, especially if it's something that people don't do very often. They will be able to complete the task more often, better, without going to help desk as much. You'll see great results if you can incorporate stories into your products and your workflows. Here's another good one. When asked to pick between two of the same exact wine, most people would rather, and you say, these same wines here, which would you rather? Most people go like number 2. The only difference here is that the price is a little bit smaller on the left, number 2. And it's that when people see a smaller price, your brain does the heuristic and it thinks, oh, that actually costs less than the bigger price, because it's like the time and space conflation. And no, again, we don't do any of this consciously. It's all subconscious and you don't know you're doing it, but yet it's happening. If you were actually presenting some wines or anything, right, you may consider how the prices are, what the font sizes are. All of this plays into how people make these selections. And it's part of choice architecture. And you will find this also in the realm of dark patterns, because some folks use these kind of fonts and font sizes and the way the data is presented to take more of people's money in a nefarious way, right? In here, we're just doing it to present the best options to users. You can use this for good as well as bad. So I'm going to say use it for good. but know that this is how this happens. So most people choose number 2 there. And similarly, if I had like a sale, right? And Amazon even noticed this. If you have a sale price, I actually left the price the same. It should have been a higher price. I forgot to change the slide. But they would have like a price crossed out, a higher price. If that price is closer to the one they're selling it at, it doesn't seem like quite a good discount as it does if you move it away horizontally, right? Actually, I would even switch these if it were up to me. Most list it, the price, and then what it was, right? The original crossed out, right? So you could tell by it being crossed out that that's usually what it means. That was the original price. But what they'll do is I would actually move the new price over to the right, the future, so that people would conflate that. And then the old antiquated price to the left, maybe, right? And make it a little bit bigger and perhaps in a different color, right? But a color that's amenable to color blindness. So not red, right? But something else. And do things like that. And of course, with this would come some A/B testing to see how your users react. But those are some things I would consider doing, just, to get people to be able to see this was what the price was, and it is what it is now. It is a legit sale. I'm not doing any bad stuff here, but this kind of helps lend the notion that they know it is a sale. So again, the same kind of thing with fonts and positioning and layout. In the physical world, right? So a lot of Belgians here, so you know about drinking, right? I rather like the hard stuff here, but I do like lambic. But the shape of your glass influences your alcohol consumption, right? So nice smooth wine glasses allow you to have a different experience than your traditional whiskey glass. So everything, right? And you don't even realize that you're making that choice when you're drinking some whiskey or some wine or a beer or whatever it is, that the shape of your glass actually influences your consumption. Similarly, other things that influence folks. Which more on influence, there is a psychologist named Robert Cialdini, and he wrote, it was called Influence, the Power of Persuasion. And it talks about using things like this to persuade people to do things or not. Again, those could be some real life dark patterns, but also some could be patterns for good. Right? Another one would be in the US, folks were asked at the start of, say, a seminar to write down the last 2 digits of their social security number or telephone number or some number that was important to them. And then later they were asked to bid how much they would pay for a product. And the ones who had higher numbers in their phone or social security number bid higher than the ones that had lower ones. So these things are happening, bombarding you, and you don't even know it. And we're just going along with the heuristics. Why? Because for the most part, you drink a little bit more, you're probably going to get a hangover, right? So that's probably going to most likely be the worst, right? If you were just a nice casual drinker. But with the numbers, you could be bidding more than you thought on a product or paying more for a car or something else. Same thing when you present those choices. Another thing that you'll probably notice if you go onto an online shopping site, you'll see a product. Maybe you browse several pages because you like going shopping online. You'll see this product again and again. It's called the mere exposure effect. Actually, this is also something, if you tie this in with the rhyming and the clear language, it's the more you see it, the more you like it. So the more things keep showing up is the more you like it. So you keep seeing somebody's face on TV, eventually you'll like them. Often people, once they start dating, the more they see each other, actually, the more they like each other. Part of this is, you have your spouse. Part of why is from the mere exposure effect, right? You see them and see them more, and then you do like them a little more, right? So you have to keep getting yourself out in front of people. They teach this in sales training. They don't usually say the mere exposure effect, but they will say, get yourself in front of people and keep placing your face and your name in front of people you want to sell to for sales and marketing. They actually teach this in classes. right? And so this is the techniques to do that. Get them your business card. This is why swag exists. So if we go to conferences or user groups and you get the pen with the logo or a little bag or stickers, right? The more you keep seeing that name, the more it keeps showing up, the more amenable you are to it. So every time you get a piece of swag, that's one thing that they're doing. Another thing that they're doing with a piece of swag that is not in the slides is what's called the principle of reciprocity. If I give you a gift, no matter how insignificant, inexpensive, and trivial it is, you feel obligated to return the favor. So if I give you a pen, pens could cost a lot of money, but if you're getting it as swag at a conference, it probably costs 25 cents. It's not a lot of money. Or a few stickers, no matter how insignificant, it does create a sense of indebtedness. It is a human heuristic. And Robert Cialdini in his book likened this to saying humans work like those little toys where you just go click and they go whir and off they go. You just push the button and they go off. Humans do this too. And this is one of those principles. So exposure and reciprocity can create a nice feedback loop where you keep exposing and getting people feeling indebted to you. And this happens. You can use these in meetings as well as in software and in many other facets of life. There's also more manipulation about your autopilots. I love this one. This was so fun. I actually worked at a couple companies that did this. Now everybody's at home, so you have your own snack boxes. But this was a popular thing in the US for a while. Instead of getting a vending machine, the company would have these little snack boxes, a little cardboard box. And you see here, there's a little, $1, and there's this little slot here. And the front of the box is like an empty space. And you put $1 in there. There's no mechanism. It's just an empty box. And you just put the money in on your honor and you take a snack. Except what happens is this is not next to someone's desk. And they go to the kitchen just planning on coffee. And they go, oh, there's a snack. Oh, crap, I didn't bring my $1. All right, I'm just going to grab these cheese doodles. And when I come back for the coffee next time, I am going to bring the $1, right? Except, you're working and you get caught up with stuff and you forget. And they said what happens is something like 80% of the time people do this, right? And there are, of course, a few people who are not so honorable and they just take a few snacks, right? But from those people aside, most people are just well-intended, meaning to pay the money back, and they just do this a little too often and forget. And then what happens is 80% of the people do this. But what they did an experiment, and this showed up in the Freakonomics book from way back. And I think also Malcolm Gladwell may have mentioned it. If you see something like this, the best way to actually turn the tables is to go get a magazine and cut out a picture of eyes and just put them above the snack box. And the fact that you think that, we know somebody is literally not watching us, it's just a picture, but people are all of a sudden feel like they're monitored. And then what happens is almost 100% of the people will go back and get the $1 and put it back because they're being watched and they're being reminded, right? So that is a little manipulation, but it's to get people to do what they technically should be doing. I know you're well-intended. You meant to bring, you didn't want to take the snack to begin with. You couldn't help it. They're so tasty. And you plan on coming back later, but it just didn't happen. But this actually thwarts that. So this was actually a manipulation for good in many ways. Kept people either from snacking, or it actually had them paying for the honor system snacks. And that was a real fun thing, a picture of eyes. Who would think to do something like that, other than some scientists who are working on this? So, another type of bias is thinking about the things that we don't think about, or that aren't apparent. This is the outside of the box thinking, or in this case, the plane. So during the war, planes went out and they got shot, right? And then some planes returned and the military went and mapped all of the places where there was shots that hit the plane. And they put little red dots. So you could see these clear areas where it was shot. And they said, okay, so this plane returned. The red dots are the strikes. And you, military analysts, must fortify the next round of planes. And this has been going around the internet, so you may have seen this recently. They say, which section of the plane do you fortify? And most people take a look at this unless you've seen it before, and you say, oh, well, like here, where the dots are, that's where it was shot. Well, that is where it was shot, but come back later now. What happens is those are the planes that came back. So the ones that didn't come back were actually shot in these blank areas, right? So that's where you need to fortify it, because you need to fortify so that they will come back, right? And that's what's called survivor bias, right? There's also another survivor bias, which is, hell, if I quit smoking, everybody can quit smoking, right? That kind of thing. No, things are different for everybody. But in this case, this is another example of survivorship bias, or also an example of, not thinking outside of the box, right? We're just thinking, well, this seems obvious, but, what about the inverse, right? What about those places that weren't shot? Why weren't they shot? And what about the planes that didn't come back? Like that missing data, right? So that's kind of the important thing here. Consider that when you build your software, right? Mostly what's going in on your side, more so than what's presented to the user, right? Because you need to work on this, the missing data piece, right? And there's a nice little article on Medium about that. Right? So now that we see some of these, right? Now I went over some of the most common or more poignant heuristics biases, right? But there are more. There are many, many, many more, right? So what do you do now that look at all this stuff and that we should think about, or which things should we think about, when to apply them, and all that stuff. So what do I do now with the critical thinking? So here's what we can do. First off, go out and start learning more about these biases. And remember, again, they're not bad. It's just a thing that humans do. It's like breathing, right? It's what we do. There's also, if you just Google like cognitive biases in software development, you will see ways that these biases aren't simply real world biases, but software is the real world too, and they show up there. And how you can do both sides, right? Presenting software to the user to make it much better for the user, right? And by looking at these biases, we are crafting empathy, right? Or at least some of it, right? It's not always 100% empathy. There's much more to it than that, but we can still, empathy is a skill, and we can keep developing that, right? So looking at more biases specifically in software development, and then also the biases that might show up in your meetings and in the way that teams function as well, right? So go look at them. Look at physical product design. There's a lot to be taken from physical product design. Design of cars and boats and bicycles and coffee makers and I was in Russia just before the pandemic, and they had just a water cooker, and this should be easy to operate no matter if you read the language or not, but nobody could figure it out. We had to get our Russian friends at our office to actually show us what all the buttons do and label it in English, because it was super complex. It was like a spaceship, and I was like, that is just a complex design for making tea. It took way longer than it should. So things like that show up. Physical product design is a good place to learn about good and bad design. Here's some resources. Design for Critical Thinking is a little online book, and David Dylan Thomas gives some talks about this as well. You'll see a lot of these same examples show up in here. He also does a bias podcast. Daniel Kahneman did many studies. He's a scientist who works in this spectrum about heuristics and biases, and Thinking Fast and Slow is a very popular book, very good, and it shows you things like, like with the airplane, just slow down. And when you slow down, you're not doing things automatically. Just remember, like, keep thinking, we do things automatically. Am I doing something automatically? Where can I slow down and think differently about this? Also, nudge. It's about decision making, right? And while it talks about things in general for health, wealth, happiness, you can apply all of this to software as well, because it's, your users have to make decisions when they're working with your software every moment that they're doing so. So, how can you help ease them through the proper decisions that they need to make? How can you frame it properly? How can you present the data, that lends them to being able to work with the software well? Dark Patterns website, right? You can go down there to see how people nefariously do it and make sure if you see these, a lot of these nefarious patterns are actually, some of them are actually meant to be bad, and some of them are accidentally bad. Somebody said, why don't we do this thing? And people just didn't think about it and they applied it. So if you learn, and then you could say, hey, look, did you know this is a dark pattern? I would like to bring this up in the meeting. I don't think this is appropriate. So that can help maybe build better software. And instead of having people who are like, hey, I can't cancel my subscription, I hate this service of yours or the software. Well, you could have people that did get to cancel but had a great experience and would maybe recommend it to somebody else, though. Like, I had to cancel, but it's because I didn't have enough money this month. I think you should get it, though, because you do, right? Things like that. A couple of other links too about critical thinking, and should and shouldn't, some things that you should do. And that's what I have for resources. And I hope that people can take these and start digging a little bit more into the ways we can actually make a better experience for everybody. So what'll happen is if we're, just kind of running on normal software building, you get average software that works for, there's a bell curve of people, and it'll work for people at the top of that curve. But folks on the outline, which often are folks with accessibility needs, minorities, other groups that are not always represented, they often are left out. And turns out, if you take a look at the economic stats, their purchasing power rivals that of the majority. So you don't want to miss out on that money. As a matter of fact, for those with disabilities, turns out that 100% of us will have a disability at some point in our life. As you age, right? I was just at the doctor's and I'm going, is this an old person's thing? Like, as you're aging with like not being able to hear as good in your eyes and stuff like that. So things deteriorate, but also you might have a surgery or just, an injury that takes you out for a bit, and you'll find out how terrible it is to use certain pieces of software when that happens. That's 25% of the population. And there is no manager worth their salt on earth that is going to snub their nose at 25% of money that could be had, right? Of revenue or, purchases or whatever, because we just didn't consider these people, right? We didn't think about them. We didn't have the empathy for them. And we didn't work within our bias context to be able to take a look at what the heuristics might be with them and with us and between us to make their software better. So, we want the money, right? That's what we want. We want to be paid well as programmers, and we do that by building products that sell. That is the bottom line. And, doing this makes things better. At JetBrains, I could say we actually have research. We have psychologists out the wazoo, and they do research on this stuff constantly. And all of our decisions, we try to work within these heuristics and these frameworks to make the UI and, the way that we write software and our team building and even our advocacy and marketing, the way we present things in an appropriate way so that we can alleviate all of these. You're going to still have the bias. It happens because that's humans and that's okay. But we want to be more aware and be able to help alleviate some of the harder biases and make it better. And that's what it's all about. And that's what we want to do. So that's what I have. Thank you, everybody. And I guess back to you, Lindsay.